Now, there are a few of us, not so many of us right now sitting in this chamber, who would remember the 1970s and the big queues for petrol as a global oil crisis hit our country. And I remember as a kid sitting in a car on, I can't remember if it was odd or even days, whichever day my parents were allowed to go and get petrol, and thinking, this is strange, we're wasting an awful lot of time. Even as a kid, we sang a lot of songs sitting in the car in a petrol queue waiting to get petrol. Now, that I hope is not a vision that the government wished to see repeated, but there has been such a delay in taking any action on the fuel situation that we face in Australia that it's a wonder that we didn't get back to that. And it is partly, I think the thing that sits with me is partly why I think our fuel security from a consumer perspective is so important. I live in a peri-urban area. We go everywhere by car. When fuel prices go up, we feel it first. We spend more on fuel and tolls, and we don't have an easy option of public transport to replace it. And so this fundamental issue of a security of supply of fuel, it is absolutely essential for a community like Macquarie. Back in 2017, I sat on JSCOT, and this issue came up in the context of Australia's international obligations to have reserves, fuel reserves, and this was ran adjacent to it. And I remember there being questions about it. We were failing to meet our global agreements around international fuel supplies at that time, and I think that continues to this day. But I remember the department talking about our own sources of supply here, and we were reassured that we imported crude oil from 21 countries and we refined product from 47 countries, so there were multiple sources. But even at that time, that didn't help meet our international obligations, and at that time there were real concerns about our long-term fuel security. Now, that was 2017. And that goes to just how long this issue has been around and how slow this government has been to do anything tangible. And when they do come up with something tangible, and these bills are welcome, but they are the consequence of a failure. It's only action after there's been failure, after more Australian refineries have closed down. No one questions that a secure fuel supply is critical, not just to drivers and commuters in my electorate, but to our whole economy, to our ability to be able to move across this great land, to be able to, to mix my metaphors, grease the wheels of the economy. We need it not just for travelling by land, we need it for flying, we need it for the movement of groceries and construction supplies, medical equipment. We've seen that need even more. We saw the need extraordinarily in my electorate in March when floods closed every route, and the first one to open up, the first road to open, required a 5-hour trip to get groceries delivered. So we need to know that that fuel is going to be there, but it's only now that we are close to nearly 100% dependency on international supply chains, and we're seeing job losses across the refineries sector as 50% of our refineries close, that we're getting action. As I say, this wasn't unforeseen. In a Senate inquiry in 2015 actually was the first in recent times to recommend the government undertake a comprehensive review of Australia's fuel security problem. It took 3 years until the timing when I was doing my parallel inquiry into our global obligations around fuel, that there was an inquiry that happened. And so not until 2018, with a due date of release of 2019. It just seems odd to me that fuel security and the job of thousands of refinery workers only gets noticed when things are really a problem, when things are really going bad. The interim report on liquid fuel security was delivered to the government 2 years ago, in April 2019. But we still haven't seen the final report. It was due late 2019, so we can't blame COVID for that one. But we have not seen a report. The government chose not to act then, not even to deliver the final report. Thanks to that failure, we have been left almost entirely reliant on global supply chains, on one of our most critical economic inputs. So we do know, though, that the interim report identified a number of things that could have been acted on in the last over 2 years ago. Things like non-compliance with the international energy obligations for domestic fuel stocks, which I've already referred to, and our requirement to have 90 days of fuel stocks domestically to help protect against global and domestic oil shocks, which I've also mentioned. We weren't compliant then, and we're not compliant now. But we could have done something about that, and there has been very small steps taken to address that issue. I think when we talk about supplies now, we are at 58 days in our global agreement. That's 32 days short of the 90 days we've said we would have fuel stocks for. You know, we're not just letting down Australians when we do that. We're not meeting our international obligations on it. The average Australian home spends the same amount of money on fuel as they do on electricity and gas combined. Now, I haven't seen the data for my electorate, but I'd wager that we spend more because of the distances that we have to travel. But we also need fuel stocks for industry. We need it for defence. We needed it when we had planes fighting bushfires. Aviation is essential, and the world is becoming increasingly volatile. And for a government that seems to like to talk a lot about national security, they have, for the last 8 years, just been absent from this debate about how we secure our fuel supply. We have been an outlier, and it is interesting to think about the government policy that makes us more and more dependent on fuel as drivers with our cars, because we don't have a policy around electric cars to encourage people to find an alternative. And it's one of those ironies that when you think about it, we're becoming fuel security is more of an issue, yet we are more reliant than ever. Think about it. If there were a policy that encouraged people to buy electric cars, that would actually lessen our dependence as consumers, as drivers, on petrol, and ease up the demands on fuel. The Electric Vehicle Council notes not just a lack of policy, but the consequence of that, saying that that's created a market here where we are uniquely hostile to electric vehicles. Now, that's not the average punter, but that's the policy settings that we face. We used to try and be world leaders in Australia. We used to pride ourselves on being early adopters, being ahead of the pack, even inventing things and leading the world that way. Things like there's any number of things, though, where we're not doing that now. We're not leading the world in terms of electric vehicles. We're certainly not leading the world in our development of vaccines and helping to meet the needs of the current demands. We are at the back of the pack in a whole lot of ways, and electric vehicles is one of those. Only 0.7% of cars sold here are electric. That's compared to a global average of 4.2%. Now, in the United Kingdom and the European Union, it's 11%, and in Norway, 75%. And it isn't because Australians don't want them. A majority of Australians say they would consider one for their next car, but they're not available at an affordable price. There are no electric cars available in Australia for under $40,000, and there are only 5 that you can buy for under $60,000. Now, compare that to the United Kingdom. In the UK, there are 8 models that are cheaper than the cheapest model in Australia. And that's because we've had policy settings that lock us into the old technology of petrol-powered cars. It's inaction and it's scaremongering by those opposite. Who can forget that the Prime Minister and multiple frontbenchers last election were saying that electric vehicles will end the weekend, will stop people from being able to enjoy their weekend? Well, what a nonsense, because we can see all the models that are coming out from the major car manufacturers. It's just that they're not coming here because we don't have policy to support them, and they're not going to get here in any decent numbers until we do. And that is going to make us more and more dependent on traditional fuel supply. Labor has an electric car discount policy that is going to cut the import tariffs and fringe benefits tax off non-luxury electric vehicles, and that can be a game-changer for our industry. But in the meantime, we're left with a bill like this that requires us to back in some things to support fuel security, which we will do, but we know this is not going far enough. One of the key problems with the bill that we're facing is that it's all announcement and it's not so much delivery. I'm really getting sick and tired of hearing people on the other side talk about the pandemic as being the reason that we found ourselves in this situation, when we know there's a very long history, going back to that Senate inquiry in 2015, quite a few years before COVID. And I think we can't, I really hope that those opposite don't try and under the cover of COVID, pull this one off. It is a reminder to the House. Well, actually, let's just think about what was actually promised compared to what's been delivered in the time that I've got left. So, from the Minister, Energy Minister, Minister Taylor, and the Prime Minister, from the announcements that they made, because they are very good at announcements, just not very good at delivery. But they announced a fuel security package that was going to secure Australia's long-term fuel supply, and it was going to create over 1,000 new jobs. So let's just be clear what we've seen since that announcement. The closure of 2 of Australia's only 4 remaining refineries. So half the refineries that we have in this country closed since their announcement. I don't call that job creation. In September, the Prime Minister and the Minister again claimed their package would back local refineries to stay open. And then we had, 6 weeks later, on October the 30th, the Kwinana refinery in Western Australia announced it would close 6 weeks later. On the 14th of December, the Minister claimed the government was taking immediate and decisive action to keep our domestic refineries operating. Well, hear, we all say. But no, within 2 months, on the 10th of February this year, Exxon announced its Altona refinery would also close. And what about the jobs? What about the people who no longer have a job in a refinery as a result? Those 2 refineries alone directly employ 950 people between them. So perhaps when the government was announcing 1,000 new jobs, they should have been saying we're getting rid of nearly 1,000 jobs. There are also thousands more jobs in fuel-dependent industries that are on the line. The petrochemical manufacturers all rely on byproducts produced from these refineries, the ones that have announced closures. I think what that shows us is it's just more proof that the government knows how to talk about jobs but doesn't actually know how to deliver them for this country and for Australians. It was clear to us when these announcements were made that it wouldn't be enough. We warned that it wasn't enough. It failed to address Australia's fuel security needs, just as we've been warning for years about our increasing dependence on foreign fuel imports in a changing world that we face. Problems with our fuel security and the need to have greater onshore stocks existed long before COVID. Long before. Go back 6 years. But this government, as always, chose not to act. It waits until the very last minute before it does something. Always waiting, always too slow, and never enough.